everyone. This is J.D. Seal, and I'm Vice President at Skyview Partners, and I want to welcome you today to our session on step-by-step approach to implementing object-level security presented by Carol Woodbury. More and more organizations are certainly realizing the need for implementing object-level security, and the questions many administrators have is, how do you secure files without breaking the application or other processes, and also how do you keep them that way as well? It's another question we get a lot. We'll answer that in another session. During this presentation, security expert Carol Woodbury will discuss how you make sure that you can implement object-level security in a step-by-step approach. She'll cover configuration options, testing steps, certain gotchas that you have to avoid, along with real-life examples. Today's session is Coffee with Carol. This is the session that Carol presented at Common, so if you missed that a month ago, you get to get it here. Sponsored by Skyview Partners. At Skyview Partners, we are committed to delivering products and services that not only provide our customers with sound advice, but also saves you time and reduces the cost and simplifies the management of security administration, including compliance. Again, today's presenter is security expert Carol Woodbury, co-founder, president, and CTO of Skyview Partners. Prior to forming Skyview, Carol spent 16+ years at IBM in positions including Chief Engineering Manager and Security Architect for IBM's I-Series Security Group. She's also author of the new book, IBM I Security Administration and Compliance, now available on MC Press Online. You will also get that URL after the webinar as well. Software available from Skyview Partners includes the Skyview Risk Assessor Diagnostic Tool, Skyview Policy Minder Administration Tool, Audit Journal Reporter, predefined auditor-ready reports, and also now Policy Minder for IBM AIX. And keep in mind that at Skyview Partners we don't charge for installation and basic configuration, so we will get you up and running virtually immediately. Services available from Skyview include the very popular Security Checkup, which is the outsourcing of your vulnerability review, including a review of your results with Skyview Partners directly and documentation after the review, and a special review for those of you that need a checkup for J.D. Edwards. We also do numerous re-architecture and remediation services for your specific projects, i.e. implementing object-level security. And also we have Skyview's managed services for compliance reporting, which we've just started to roll out, where you let Skyview monitor your security configuration for non-compliant events. So with that, I want to thank you again for coming today, and I want to introduce our presenter on step-by-step approach to implementing object-level security, Carol Woodbury. Good morning, Carol.
Good morning, JD, and thanks everyone for joining me. I really appreciate your taking the time. This presentation is packed full of details and information, so don't feel bad if you don't catch it all at once. As JD said, you'll receive a link to these handouts, and hopefully the recording will work, and you'll get a link to the recording so that you can come back and watch that as well. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. The only thing I will mention is that I now am tweeting, so if you want to follow my Twitter, I have the link there at Carol Woodbury. Okay, so the agenda today is to discuss how you get started with object-level security. So that's how we'll start this presentation. We'll talk through the current popular application security schemes and why they're problematic, why they pose a risk to your data. We'll talk about the methods that you can use to secure your data. Then we'll talk through, and the majority of the presentation talks through how you make the changes with the emphasis on avoiding breakage. So when we go into our clients, this is the exact methodology that we use. And we have kind of fine-tuned this so we avoid as much breakage as possible. All right, so where do you start with object-level security? The thing that I think a lot of people are overwhelmed with is the thought that they have to change the authority on every object on the system, and that is simply not true. The place that you want to start is that you find the data that actually needs to be secured. So to do that, you have to kind of think through the type of data that you have that is associated with your applications. And when I mean the type of data, I mean, is it private data? Is it company confidential data? Is it data that should only be used internally but not externally? So that's what I mean by type of data. So the type of data, when I say private data, that would be things like Social Security numbers or social insurance numbers, depending on your where you live, which country you live in, bank account numbers, salary information, the health care information, and so forth. So that is constituted as private data. Things like credit card numbers is also private data, but a credit card number is obviously an easy example of something that you want to keep secure. Now, something that may not be as obvious that you would want to keep confidential would be something like company proprietary information. And that's where a lot of people don't stop to think about the value of the data on their system. If you think about things like your pricing information or perhaps your inventory information, maybe your list of vendors, if you're a retailer, where you get your supplies from, maybe that's very unique to your organization. All of those things that make it very proprietary, that give you the advantage over your competitors, that could be the company proprietary information. And that's the information that most people don't think about needing to be confidential. But if you think about the value of the data to your organization, that is where a lot of value lies. And so therefore you would want to protect it. So the type of data that you have associated with each of your applications is really what is going to determine how that data needs to be secured. And that's really driven by the data definition or the data classification part of your security policy. And that part of your security policy is often driven by regulatory compliance requirements. Things like PCI DSS, the payment card industry, data security standards, and so forth. So what is your data access policy? Again, it's driven by the classification of the data, and it's really a determination of who should be allowed to see that data. And not individuals like Sally, Dick, Jane, but it's things like, by default, should this data be available to be seen by everyone on the system, or should it be deny by default, which translated into IBM-I terms is public exclude. And then perhaps some people do need to see the data. That would be the people with a direct job requirement to see the data, or anyone in the company can see the data, in other words, public use. So the thing that you have to realize when you are looking at a traditional IBM-I system, this is typically how it's set up from an application point of view. And these are one of the many traditional applications. So you have a user sign on, they see a menu, in this case it's an accounting menu, 1, 2, 3, and there's usually a file within the application that controls who can see which menu items. And that's really a great way to start your application security. The problem is the system hasn't been configured like this in years. And so the risk to the data is really from all of these other ways that you can access data. So if you think about the file that is controlling who can access which menu item, that does not come into play for any of these other ways that you can access the data that are listed here on the right side of the screen. So things like query, SQL, certainly the things coming in over the network like sockets, DDM, FTP, ODBC. And a lot of people fail to consider the fact that there are people that are not limited and can see a command line. And those are people typically like operators or database administrators, analysts, developers. They have a legitimate command line access, and they can access this data as well. Then things like processes that allow downloads to PCs. So you really have to think about how exposed this data is and who should actually be allowed to see this data from outside of the application, namely these things on the right side of the screen. So when I5OS is set up and when it's been architected back in Rochester, one of the things that's architected are these things called a machine instruction. And that's actually what runs at the lowest level of the operating system down in SLIC. And that's what actually causes the system to work. Part of that architecture says what authority is required to run that thing called a machine instruction. And so the way that it manifests itself to all of us is that to be able to run an application, the process that's running the application has to have sufficient authority to run all of those MI instructions. So for example, if you're doing an open, a database open, depending on whether you're doing it to update the file or to just read the file, the machine instruction has been architected to require the process to have sufficient authority. So the way that our applications have been architected must allow the users running the application to have that authority to run the underlying machine instructions. So the way that that can happen is typically one of these three items, and these are the ones that are problematic, but they're the most popular. So one of the ways that application writers ensure that the users have sufficient authority is to require that all application users have all object. Now, obviously, the problem with that is that everybody has all object, so they can do basically whatever they want to any object on the system. So no auditor likes to see end users having all object. The next option that a lot of application designers use is to have the users of the application be a member of the group that owns the application. And in this case, what happens is that all of the application users end up being the owner of all of the application objects, which means they have all authority to those objects. And the last option is that the public authority or the default authority on the objects is set such that it allows the application to run. Okay, so here's a little bit more of a visual for how that all works. Whoops, I'm sorry. Let me explain public authority one more time. The public authority is the default setting. So if you don't get authority from any place else, the public authority is the authority that the user gets to the object. So a lot of application writers will set the public authority of especially files to be all or perhaps change, which allows modification by anybody on the system. I've also seen application writers, use a combination of these. In fact, I've seen one banking application use all three of these. All the end users had all object. They were a member of the group that owned the application, and yes, public authority was set to all. So it was assured that that banking application would never receive an authority failure. So easy to run from a security perspective, but a horribly wide open risk to that data. And if we think about it, the reason we are even interested in object level security is because you're trying to reduce the risk to the data. So that's our goal here, is reducing risk to the data. When the data is public authority of all, you can imagine that the risk to that data is quite large. So the risk of accidental errors, like somebody accidentally updating it or replacing a record when they shouldn't or didn't mean to, is incredibly high when you have that data wide open. Okay, so what has been tried? I've talked with a lot of you who have tried to implement object level security and didn't quite get the whole methodology in place, and so that's why you're sitting in this class. And so what a lot of people will do, and I've seen this happen after an auditor has come through, the auditor has demanded that the database files be set to public exclude, so that's done, and what happens is that a lot of breakage occurs. And why is that? Well, it breaks because there are legitimate reasons why some people and some processes may need to access that data from outside of the application. So the methodology that we use at Skyview Partners is that the programs are changed to adopt authority. There's an application profile, and it owns all of the programs, all of the application objects. The public authority of the data has been set to exclude, and the programs are set to owner, which means that they adopt. The application users are authorized to the initial program of the application, and then we determine what other application profiles or individuals or groups need use. They need to read the data to be able to perform things like an ODBC or an FTP transfer or something like that. There are also occasions when there may be outside processes that need to have change authority or be able to update that authority. So that's the methodology we're going to use and we're going to talk through in this session. So as I was saying before, the methodology that we use to ensure that the application users can still sufficiently have enough authority to run the application is that we use adopted authority. So adopted authority is an attribute of a program, and it is used to temporarily give authority while the program is running. When a program is active or in the call stack and it adopts authority, the user calling that program has the available to them the special authorities that the program owner has, as well as any private authorities that that program owner might have. So let's look at an example. The example that we're going to use is this program is called QCMD Sec Offer. The owner is CJW, and it has been set to adopt by using this user profile attribute right here. Now, a lot of people, let me scroll back here. A lot of people think that the thing that causes a program to adopt is this use adopted authority attribute, and that's not it. I realize that the terminology is confusing, but that's not what causes a program to adopt. It's this attribute called user profile. By default, programs are created to not adopt authority. So if you do a display program on most programs, the attribute will be set to star user, and that means it only runs with the authority of the person calling the program. When it's set to star owner, it is available to the process the authority of the program owner. So in this case, it would be CJW, the authority that CJW has. And I'll explain this use adopted authority attribute in just a minute. Okay, so let's walk through an example. We have an example where a program needs to open a file called ABC, and it needs to open it for update. So the person calling this program is trying to change the file, the contents of the file. So the owner of the file is this profile called application_owner. The public authority of the file is set to exclude. So program A, and think of program A as being something like a menu option. So we take menu option 1 that calls program A. That program is also owned by application owner, and it is configured to be user profile star owner. So when program A is active or in the call stack, then the authority that is first checked to the file called ABC, CJW's authority is the authority that will be checked first. Now, if CJW happens to have authority to the file, change or greater, then she will be able to make that update. But she doesn't have any authority in this case, and it is public exclude. So normally she would be getting a not authorized message when she tries to do this update. But since the program is configured to adopt authority, she has at her disposal the authority that this application owner profile has to the file. So lo and behold, application owner, which owns this program, also owns the file. So application owner has all authority to the file. So rather than getting the not authorized message, CJW will be able to make the update. Okay, so that's what happens in that case. Now say you have a program A and it's calling program B. Now program B is going to do something that requires a security officer authority to be required. And so in this case, again, program B is configured to adopt authority. It's user profile start owner. This time it's owned by QSecOffer, which we all know has all authority on the system. So when the action is trying to be occurred, if CJW doesn't have sufficient authority, it checks then to see if application owner has authority. And the application owner authority comes from this previous program, so it will propagate that adopted authority down to the next level. So if application owner doesn't have enough authority, then it will check QSecOffer, and of course QSecOffer has authority, so it will be able to do whatever it wants to. Now there may be a time when you don't want the adopted authority to be used or consumed by the next program in the call stack. So say that program B called a program that put up a command line. Maybe there's a function key that puts up a command line. Well, obviously, you do not want the authority of QSecOffer to flow out to that command line. If you did that or allowed that, then obviously the person pressing that command key now has all authority on the system. So obviously, you'd want to avoid that. So the scenario is this. We have a program that's called command line. It's calling the API that puts up the CO command line. It is also owned by application owner, but it is configured to be user profile star user. And here's where that use adopted authority comes in. Use adopted authority is set to no. By default, it is set to yes, but in this case, we've changed it and it's no. What that does is basically, see this blue line across, this is the authorities that are in effect. When the use adopted authority no is specified, it basically blocks the adopted authority that has been set in place by previous invocations of programs. So it blocks anything, and this program, the command line program, will not consume or use any adopted authority from higher in the call stack. So we're back to the original person calling the program, which is CJW. So that's how that would work. Okay, so enough on adopted authority, or at least for right now. The other technique that we use is authorization lists. Now, one of the reasons that we use authorization lists is because, remember at the beginning I said I like to avoid breakage. And the use of authorization lists helps us avoid breakage. Now, how does it do that? Well, if you've ever tried to change the ownership or authority on a file when it's in use, you know that that is blocked. It's prohibited by the operating system. So one thing I like to do is have at least one and probably two, maybe three authorization lists when I go to rework the authority on an application. And I do that, and I connect all of my database files to an authorization list. And the reason that I do that is so that if for some reason I have forgotten a process that needs authority to a file from outside, so perhaps I've forgotten an FTP process, and it's during the middle of the day, and maybe this is a process that FTPs a file off to maybe my payroll processing. if I have forgotten that, then, and the public authority of the files is set to exclude, then I'm going to have to wait to do that processing until I can bring that entire application down and that file is no longer open. Well, that can cause significant disruption. So if I have an authorization list, the beauty with an authorization list is that I can put the profile running that FTP process on the authorization list, even though the file is open. And then I automatically have given that profile authority to the authorization list and all of the files that that authorization list secures. So here's how an authorization list works. I have several files. In this case, it's a receivables application, so I have a January, February, March, and obviously by now we'd have a April, May, and June. So we have all these files. The same users need the same authority to all of these files. So rather than grant a private authority to each of these individual profiles to these files, instead I've granted authority to the authorization list and then associated that authorization list to each one of these files. So by virtue of having the March receivables file be secured with this AR authorization list, John V. has used authority to not just the March receivables, but also to February, January, and now April, May, and June. So it's a very simple way to give the same users authority to multiple objects. It doesn't have to be just files, but for sure I use it for files. So authorization lists are another concept and another tool that IBM I has that makes this process significantly easier. So we've talked about adopted authority. That's an important concept to have. We've talked about authorization lists. That's an important concept to have. So the way that you need to start out is or the next thing that you need to do is to determine what the default public authority is to be for the objects that you're going to change. Now, this presentation kind of assumes that you're going to change an entire application. You may just be changing one file or a handful of files. So you may not need to go through this entire analysis, but this same scheme will work whether you're just securing one file or an entire application. And again, I'm referring to files because, again, why are we thinking about object level security? It's really reducing the risk to the data. So that's why I'm concentrating on talking about the default access to files, because that's where the data is. So we need to determine the public authority, and for sure we need to do it for files, but if you want to rework the authority settings for all of the application objects, here are some guidelines for doing that. So things that can usually be set to public use are directories, programs and service programs, display files, message files. There are some objects that need to remain at public change, things like out queues and message queues typically. You may have some libraries where temporary objects are being created, device descriptions have to be public change, and so forth. So then files, again, is where you want to concentrate. Files containing private or confidential data typically need to be set to public authority of exclude, or that deny by default. Files containing data that anybody can see, so they can be read. Files contain data that is okay to be read by anybody on the system, but you want to ensure data integrity, so that you want to ensure that the data is not changed by anybody outside of the application. So you don't care if it's downloaded to a spreadsheet, you don't care if it's used for an FTP transfer, you just want to make sure that it is accurate and all changes come through the application. That's an appropriate time to use public authority of use. And files containing data that anybody can update, that would be set to public change, and I'm not quite sure that I've ever seen that happen. I've granted change to certain groups or individuals to certain files, but I don't think that I've ever been in a case where we have set public to change. Now, I have a reference down here to the IBM Security Reference Manual. There are a lot of cases where you look at the public authority of an object and you're not sure what the operating system may require to actually use that object. This Appendix D in the IBM Security Reference Manual lists all of the CL commands on the system, and it lists the authority required to run the objects that that CL command touches. So for example, if you're doing a display file, it would say what authority is required to the file that you're displaying. Or if you're doing an update data, which is a command that allows you to update data, it's going to tell you the authority that is required. So check if you're in doubt and you have some function that you know needs to be done against a certain object type, you can look up that command in the IBM Security Reference Manual Appendix D and find out what authority is required for that. So let me go back one screen a moment. We've talked about how you determine the appropriate public authority. Now, a public authority, or that default authority, is one step, but to avoid that breakage and avoid the situation where you set the files to be public exclude and then everything starts to fail, what you need to do is to determine how the data is being accessed from outside of the application. Now remember, we're going to assume that anything coming through the application or the application programs will have sufficient authority through what? Through the adopted authority. So you don't have to worry about programs accessing the data through the application. What you are trying to determine is those processes that are coming in from outside of the application and either using or viewing the data within this application or updating it. Okay, so this picture is just trying to be a way to trigger some of the things that may be happening on the system for that data, and it's trying to trigger your mind to think of all of the ways that the data is being used. So don't forget things like, let's assume that it's the ABC application that we're dealing with. So don't forget things like DDM connections to the files in the ABC program, or FTP from other systems. Maybe you have WebSphere or JDBC connections coming in and updating or reading the data in the ABC application. You may have other applications that are updating this. So for an example, if you are deciding to rework a payroll application, you may have other applications that feed into this and either read the data or update the data. So you may have a timekeeping application that needs to update a file in your payroll application. Or maybe you have a sales commission application that needs to update a file in your payroll application, something like that. So don't forget other applications. Don't forget to look through your batch processing to see what jobs are actually running that might use these files. Again, if the batch processing simply invokes a program that is part of the application, not to worry, because the adopted authority will provide the sufficient authority. But if it's some other process, perhaps a process that you've written yourself, you need to make sure that the profile running that batch process will have sufficient authority to do the task. You may have users that are running queries either from a menu or perhaps from a command line or from IBM iNavigator, scheduled jobs, and so forth. So what you want to do is to make a chart and record all of the ways that your applications can be updated or used from outside of that application. And you want to make sure that you know which file it is and the library. and whether the access was a read or an update, because if it's a read, then that process needs use, and if it's an update, it needs at least change. And then I like to give a characterization of what this interface is, whether it's EDI or a web application, maybe it's some other JDBC or ODBC, CDM, and so forth. And then most important is to take note of the profile that is being used to access the file. And what you're going to do is use this list later on to grant authority to these files and make sure that these tasks work. That's why I like to take a note to say what the interface is, because after you use this list, or part of the way that you use this list is to go through and run this process and test it to make sure it is working properly. Okay, so you've got your list of tests that are going on that access the data from outside of the application. So in general, and at a very high level, the steps that you're going to go through to change the application implementation, security implementation, is this. You are going to make sure that all the application objects are owned by the application profile. You are going to have to determine which programs need to be changed to adopt authority. Maybe all programs, maybe those entry point programs. The one that I prefer are everything but the initial program. The entry point program is it's used when you don't want to change all of the programs to adopt. When I say entry point programs, if you take a menu option and the task that is performed is actually done through a submitted job, that submitted job will lose the adopted authority because adopted authority is stack-based. So if you are going to only do selected programs to adopt authority, you need to make sure that any program that is used on a batch submission also adopts authority. So an entry point, that's what I mean by an entry point. My preferred method is that we typically change all of the programs to adopt except the initial program, which puts up the menu. I try to avoid having that initial, any menu program adopt because there's often a command line associated with that menu. And I don't want the adopted authority out at that command line. Okay, so you're going to make sure everything's owned properly. You're going to get the programs adopting that are supposed to adopt. Then you're going to authorize the processes and individuals as identified in your big picture, that list that we just talked about in the last slide. You're going to set the public authority, and then you're going to test. So let's see what that really looks like in more gory detail. Okay, so this is an ordered list. Okay, it may not be very bold on your screen, but you have 1 through 8 steps, and it's ordered for a reason. We have determined that if you follow this in this order, the chance for breakage is significantly reduced. If you follow it out of order, all bets are off, and don't blame me. But if you follow this order, you will have a significant less chance of breakage. No guarantees, but the chances will be reduced. So what is this list? Okay, so the scenario that we are remediating or changing from are these two. It's the case where all of the application users are required to have all object, or they are a member of the group that owns the application. Okay, so slightly different step if you are changing from a wide open public authority. That will be covered in the next slide. But in these two cases, what you want to make sure of, the very first thing that you do is to make sure that you change the ownership of the application objects to be the profile that owns the application. Okay, so In the case where the users are a member of the profile that owns the application, I leave the ownership as is and I move the users into a different group. So let's say that this application is owned by the application owner profile. So I'm going to change the ownership of all of the application objects to be owned by application owner profile. One thing that you might want to do is to check and see if any programs are owned by an all object profile and are supposed to adopt. Because if you change it from an all object profile to a non-all object profile, you might break some functions. So before you change the ownership, check and see if any of the programs are owned by an all object profile like QSEC Offer and are really supposed to be, continue to be owned by that, and put them in an exception list. Okay, so change the ownership, change the programs that are supposed to adopt. In other words, set user profile to be star owner. Then you're going to secure the files, physical files and logical files typically, with an authorization list. And I point the public authority of the objects to the authorization list. Public authority can come from one of two places, either the object itself, or if it's secured by an authorization list, the public authority can come from the authorization list. In this case, I always have it come from the authorization list, and you'll see why in just a minute. Now, when you do this, I make sure that the authorization list is wide open, meaning public authority of all or change. That's a temporary setting, but this is part of your setup, and you can be assured that nothing is going to break with this method. So the next thing that I do is authorize outside processes. So again, I just make sure that I add these processes one at a time. And which processes am I talking about? It's these processes that I have in this chart that I have discovered are accessing the data within this application, okay? And these are the processes that need to continue to work. So in the example that I used, you have a commission application that needs to update an inventory file. So I would add the profile that is running that commission report to the authorization list that is securing these files. And then I test that application and make sure it works. So I add those outside processes one at a time. And I do it one at a time instead of adding all of them at once, because I add it one at a time and then I test. And then one at a time and then I test the next thing. And that way, if something breaks, it's likely because it's the last thing you just added. And so you don't have to try searching to figure out what it was that you changed that caused something to break. And so that's why it's a very methodical, and it may take a few days to actually get all of these processes added to this authorization list. Now, if you see this note, up to this point, the end users have not been affected, only outside processes. If you recall, we have done nothing with the user profiles. So they either continue to have all object, or they continue to be a member of the group that owns the application. So the end users, the application users, have not been affected at all up to step 4. Okay, now step 5 is where you change the public authority on the authorization list to the setting that you want it to be. So if the files are supposed to be public exclude, you now change the authorization list to be public exclude. Or if they're supposed to be used, you change them to be used. So at this point in time, you do have a chance of having some random failures. And what those random failures would be any of those outside processes that you have forgotten about or somehow not accommodated. That's what will be failing at this point in time. But again, end users not affected. So what you do at this point in time is now start to work on the application side to make sure that the application continues to work. So what we typically do is find those super users of those applications. And you all know who those are. There's typically a set of users that have access to all of the menu options, and they're just kind of your power users. So when you find those people, you either remove their all object or move them into a different group profile and ask them to test. And you call them and you say, we have made some changes to the security. You should absolutely see nothing different, but if you do, please give us a call. And let them run for at least a day or two, okay? And at that point, once you make sure that the application is still working just fine, you take out a handful of users, maybe a department, and you let them run for a day. And you either move them into the group, a different group, or remove their all object. Again, you let them run for a day. So you do what I call a slow roll. You take a handful of users, you take a department, maybe the next day you take 2 departments, and within a week you might be able to take out all of the users from either having all object or group ownership. Now, if you own our Skyview PolicyMinder product, all of these steps can easily be done through that product. That is, I no longer write CL programs to do all this setup. I only use PolicyMinder to do this setup, so it's a significantly easier way to do it. But you can write CL programs to be able to do all this configuration and setup. If you do that, make sure you hang on to those programs, because if this is a third-party application, you are going to have to rerun those scripts when you do an upgrade, because they will probably wipe out all of your changes. So make sure you keep a record and keep all those CL programs around, or use our PolicyMinder product. Now, the only change when you have the scenario of having a wide open public authority, again, I don't like breakage. So what I do is I temporarily put those users and make them a member of the application owning profile. And that's so that when I go to change the public authority of that authorization list, I'm not affecting all of the application users all at once. I don't like to do that. There's just, if for some reason some part of the application needs a slight different accommodation, you have just affected all of your end users, and I just don't like the potential of doing that. Okay, so preventing breakage. The more you can understand what is accessing those files, those application files from outside of the application, the better off you are. So the more complete that list is, the better off you are. How do I do that? I sit and I talk with programmers, operators, system administrators to make sure that they can tell me those outside processes. A lot of times we will turn on auditing and look at the auditing access of those objects. If people have exit points in place, we look through the exit point logs to see what is accessing those files and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways that you can gather that information. I use the authorization list to make sure that if I need to make a last-minute change to the access and permissions on files, that I can do so and don't have to take the application down. I think about things like queries and see if we can move queries out of the main application libraries and put them in a different library so that those authorities that are required can be accommodated in a little bit different way. I make sure to look through all of the job schedule entries to make sure that the profile running the job schedule entries have sufficient authority. And I look for programs with dynamic SQL. Dynamic SQL is a different bear. The way that it is designed, and dynamic SQL is that SQL where the statement is built when the program is run. Now, you would think that simply setting the adopted authority on the program itself would also cause that dynamic SQL statement to also adopt, but it doesn't. And so you'll notice if you prompt a create SQL XXX command, like create SQL RPG command, If you prompt it and scroll down a ways, you will see this parameter called dynamic user profile. You'll see the same settings as the user profile parameter on that program. So by default, that dynamic SQL statement will not adopt. So the dynamic user profile is by default set to user. So you need to get that set to be star owner. Now the whole problem with that is that you have to do that, and the only time you can do that is when the program is compiled. For all other programs that don't contain dynamic SQL, you can change the user profile parameter using the change program command, but there is no dynamic user profile attribute on change program. So you have to go back and recompile those programs to get that dynamic SQL statement to adopt. If you are changing a vendor application, we help a lot of clients change applications like Infinium and JD Edwards. If you are going to change a third-party application, you might want to call the vendor to see if they have some guidance on how to change their applications to be more secure. Both JD Edwards and Infinium have some guidance on changing their applications, so you can always check with the vendor. The other thing is that if there is a requirement to change a program to adopt, the code has to be, if it has been compiled prior to v5.r1, so if you're on v6 or v7, this won't apply to you. But if you are still back on 5.3 or 5.4, and the program was compiled prior to v5.r1, you need to have the source or observability in that program. So this really doesn't apply to a whole lot of people anymore. Now you can use the audit journal in a couple different ways in a project like this. And I talked about it earlier. You can use it to discover what processes are updating or reading the object. So you would be looking for a ZC, which is a object change, or a ZR, which is an object read entry for those in particular files. You can also use the audit journal looking for AF or authority failure entries. Once you have done the rollout of your implementation, I look for authority failures to be proactive and try to capture and fix any problem that may be occurring before the end user sees it or before some process fails. So here's some commands that you can use for that. We also have Skyview Audit Journal Reporter product that you can use to capture the AF entries. Now the thing that I want to make sure that you do is to look at the authority failure entries before you start making any of these security changes that we've been talking about. And the reason is because there are what I call normal entries, normal authority failure entries, things that no user has ever seen a not authorized message for, things that are working as designed, again, that you never see any kind of failure or prevention of a task. So the best example of this is if you do a display user profile star all, you have to have SecAdmin special authority and use authority to the profiles you're displaying. So what happens is if you don't have use authority to all profiles, there will be an authority failure entry for any of the profiles that you don't have authority to, and that will be in the audit journal as an AF entry. So if there are 100 profiles on a system and a user only has use authority to 50 of them, there will be 50 entries. So what I encourage you to do is look at the AF entries ahead of time to make sure that you know what is normal. And so once you start rolling out these changes, you will know what's normal, and you can ignore those, and you can look for the things that are happening as a result of the changes that you made. So I'm going to skip these scenarios here real quickly in the interest of time. One of the things that you may want to consider using when you're reworking things is the use of logical files, which provide a view over a physical file. The reason you would use a logical file from a security point of view is in the case where a file has both confidential or private data and non-private data. An HR file is a really good example. Probably contains maybe a social security number or social insurance number, could contain like a bank account number, salaries, and also your address or your full name or your job title or that type of thing. So there's both confidential and non-confidential and private data in this file. So there may be a lot of applications that need to access some of that data but don't need the private data. So you can have a logical file over that physical file that provides the view to that non-private data. And if you want to make sure that you will force the use of the logical file, you just need to make sure that the process or public authority never gets operational, object operational, to the underlying physical file. You need object operational to be able to open this file. So if you remove that authority, then they're going to be forced into going through the logical and can't go through the physical. Some gotchas. All right. Forgetting to look at the audit journal before making any changes. And all of these gotchas, by the way, are things that we have experienced, so trying to help you learn from our experiences. Making the changes in the wrong order, okay, affecting more users than you intended at once. Forgetting to set the public authority of the authorization list to exclude until we've already done some testing, had to go back and do a retesting. Not understanding the order in which I-50S checks security. You really need to have a good understanding of that to be able to debug the scenarios. You also need to understand the flow of adopted authority. One thing that will get people is forgetting to make the corresponding changes in their change management software, because most change management software promotes objects with the authority settings, and so you want to get them promoted correctly and not let them come over to the production system with the wrong settings. Setting authorities to public exclude and having the library specified in a library list. We were one time changing an HR application, and so only like 10 people on the system needed access to it. So we authorized that HR group to the payroll library and set public authority to exclude. Little did we know that library was in the job description of everybody on the system. So the next morning when users tried to sign on, nobody but the HR group could log into the system because there was a library in the job description that most users were no longer authorized to. So you have to watch that one. The dynamic SQL we've talked about, and queries. Okay, so where do you start? You may want to start only with a handful of files. Perhaps the file that contains your PCI data, maybe the file that contains your HR data. You can start there. You may want to do one application, or maybe you want to do all applications. Regardless of how you start, this methodology will work for any of those three methods. One warning is that once a security starts, you will be the target and will be accused of everything that is going wrong in the system. Everything, truly everything. So what happens is that you become a great expert in debugging all sorts of problems that are occurring on the system to prove that it's basically not your problem. So it helps you become an expert on other areas of the system. So just a warning, you're going to walk around with a target on your back. All right, so for more information, there's the security reference manual that I referenced earlier. My new book, this is actually chapter 16 in my new book. This methodology is explained further in that chapter, and you can always contact Skyview Partners for more information on our remediation services. And with that, I will turn it over to JD.
Well, we told you it was going to be a full hour, and it certainly was. Again, you have a couple of minutes if you'd like to type your questions in. We probably won't have time to answer a lot of the questions, but you can certainly get your questions into the session. Carol, is there anything else you want to cover? We're right at the top of the hour, or?
Well, there was one thing, one thought I did have. We have recently helped some people. I think a lot of you are in the situation where you're moving to a new system. A lot of you I've seen are upgrading to new hardware for either V6 or V7. If you are in that situation, that is the perfect time to rework your security implementation, especially if you've got that system in with a little bit of lead time, because you can actually lay down the new security implementation ahead of actually firing it up and having it run on production. So you've got a great time to implement that new security scheme and do so in a lot shorter time period, because you don't have to worry about disrupting production. You can just implement it right away, and then as you are testing on that new hardware, the issues start coming out, if there are any. So if you are in the situation of moving to new hardware and are considering changing your security implementation, now is really the time to do that.